Euron Greyjoy stood atop the battered deck of the Silence, gazing across a bitter sea that seethed with ice floes and treacherous currents. The wind that howled in from the far north cut through even the thickest furs, slicing across skin as though it hungered for a taste of mortal warmth. Yet Euron did not shiver. His heart was too full of restless ambition, a feverish desire that no ordinary conquest could quench. He had come this far, sailing beyond the known waters of Westeros and slashing a path into distant realms rarely charted by men, because some half-wild whisperer in the free cities had told him a rumor that the legends of an ancient creature, an ice dragon, might be more than mere tales. And if it existed, Euron intended to claim it. If it would help him strike fear into every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, if it would help him usurp what he believed was his rightful place in the world, then he would do whatever it took. His madness had grown by increments over the years, each misdeed and triumph feeding into the next. And now, as the rigging of the Silence groaned in the fierce gale, Euron let his single uncovered eye drift over the horizon with an intensity that bordered on reverence. His crew, grim-faced and wary, did their best to keep their thoughts hidden. They all knew better than to cross the crow's eye with their doubts. The hush that had settled upon them was unnatural. These were Ironborn, men who generally prided themselves on bawdy laughter and savage jests, but the frigid gloom that oozed from the ice-filled waters seemed to have stolen even their capacity for crude merriment. Euron did not mind their silence. It served him better when they feared him as much as the waters they sailed upon. The occasional creak of timber or snap of a sail against the wind broke the quiet, but no one spoke. Instead, they all listened for something unknown, the faint echo of a distant roar or the thunder of wings that might herald the impossible. Euron let them tremble. Men full of terror could be shaped to his will. The Silence lurched, navigating between shards of ice that rose from the water like jagged teeth. In the fading daylight, these chunks glistened, taking on pale hues of lavender and pink. But the sun was already beginning its slow descent behind ashen clouds. Night was a realm that possessed this place far more thoroughly than day. In the extreme north, darkness seemed to extend its claws over the world. Euron clenched the railing and leaned forward, feeling the pitch of the ship, the swirl of the wind. His lips peeled back in a smile that did not reach his eye, a silent greeting to this savage domain. The entire time, his heart hammered with anticipation. This was a hunt unlike any other, a pursuit that might end in glory beyond measure, or in doom so profound that sailors might speak of it for centuries in hushed tones. The illusions had started months ago, when Euron claimed he had glimpsed a vision in the smoky depths of a certain Myrish lens he kept locked away in his cabin. At first, his men took it as another of his cryptic boasts. They had seen him commune with strange artifacts, or so they believed, but they had never questioned him outright. Those who dared to question him never lasted long. But as the Silence ventured further north, ignoring safe ports and common sense alike, unease festered among them. Euron's dream or vision, or whatever he chose to call it, burned bright in his mind. He believed he could find and bind a power that neither the maesters of the Citadel nor the Red Priests of Volantis could fully grasp. That he would find a beast rumored only in children's stories was not outside the realm of possibility for the Crow's Eye. He had always seemed anointed, as though the drowned god or some other, darker force favored him. With each gust of wind, he recalled what he had learned of ice dragons from half-literate tomes and sailors' yarns spun in the black of night. They were said to be colossal, larger than any Valyrian dragon. Their breath was an icy wind that froze enemies solid. Their flesh was translucent, their eyes crystals of freezing flame. Many believed the myth, but Euron no longer accepted that. He had glimpsed something in that Myrish lens, a shape in the storm-lashed skies far beyond the edge of any map. It had lit a fire in him that could not be extinguished. He had made sacrifices on the deck of the Silence, vile rites under the moonlight, chanting words that few men had heard, and fewer still dared repeat. And somehow, that had guided him into these waters. His Ironborn crew tightened ropes, cursed under their breath, and cast fearful looks at their captain as shadows lengthened. The men dreaded seeing impossible shapes in the swirling snow. the monstrous outline of wings or the glare of a crystalline eye. Yet they stood steadfast, for they were ironborn, and fear only made their hearts pound with a savage thrill. Still, the deeper they sailed into these uncharted seas, the more they recognized that they followed a man who cared nothing for mortal boundaries. Euron Greyjoy had become something else, a prophet of terror, a vessel for unspeakable dreams. If the gods existed, they either scorned him or used him as an instrument of their own twisted amusements. The day gave way to a dim twilight that lasted long past reason. Clouds as gray as cold steel spread across the sky, smothering the last vestiges of sunlight. A hush like the drawing of a cosmic breath filled the air. Euron ordered torches lit along the rails, and flickering light lapped at the coils of rope and the polished surfaces of the ship's arsenal. He wore his usual attire, his dark leather coat, fastened with buckles shaped like krakens, and a cloak the color of midnight, lined with the fur of a creature unknown to Westeros. He looked half warlock, half lord, his long hair whipped by the wind across the patch over his left eye. He raised a silver goblet to his lips, indulging in the thick red wine he had brought from the south. The taste was rich, iron-kissed, and it warmed his throat on the way down. Gazing out at the boundless sea, he could sense something shifting in the air. A distant shriek, perhaps, or the tremor of a wing beat. He could not tell if it was real or conjured by his feverish imagination. He turned his head, searching the night sky, seeing only swirling darkness. But he knew that in the north, in realms so distant that not even the wildlings dared speak of them, ancient things slept, and he was Euron Greyjoy. He would wake them if it served his purpose. It began with a ghostly light along the horizon. One of the men saw it first and shouted. Euron looked. A shimmer glowed behind ice floes, as though moonlight were trapped within them. But the moon was hidden behind storm clouds. The silence on the deck grew absolute. That faint glow wavered, flickered, and then extinguished, leaving them in blackness once more. Some men crossed themselves or muttered half-forgotten prayers. Euron's grin widened. He felt the tang of possibility in the air, the sense that some boundary had been crossed, and a realm of fable hovered just out of sight. The cold bit deeper. He took another swig of wine and let the excitement coil within him. He ordered the men to steer toward that last glimmer, regardless of the swirling pack of ice. They obeyed, though they had to labor mightily, adjusting sails and rigging so the silence could move carefully through the drifting shards. Each strike against an iceberg rang out, threatening to tear the hull open. Yet the silence endured, guided by a mixture of skill and grim determination. Euron's presence alone seemed to will the ship forward. As they advanced, the wind intensified, cutting across them like a living thing with hidden teeth. Snow pelted them in waves, and the wooden deck grew slick underfoot. Still, Euron demanded that they not relent, that they push ever forward. No man dared ask him how he intended to bind a creature of winter and storm, if indeed it showed itself. Euron's confidence was legend. He had in his possession trinkets and relics of strange and foreign gods, charms collected from shadowbinders, priests, and warlocks. Perhaps those would suffice, or perhaps he simply believed that any beast could be cowed by the presence of the crow's eye. His arrogance was boundless after all. Even as the sea churned and the gloom thickened, Euron stood tall, his single eye gleaming, as though he conversed silently with whatever lurked in those skies. The hours crawled by, each moment thick with tension. Their torches began to sputter in the wind, casting dancing shadows on the pale walls of ice that loomed close. Men shivered, their furs stiff with frost. Salt crusted their beards and eyebrows. Occasionally they heard cracking sounds from beneath the water, a reminder of how close they sailed to hidden hazards. Euron relished each peril. The grim, set lines on his face never once betrayed any fear. He drank in the biting wind like a man sampling the finest wines. At intervals, he would raise a hand, stilling his men, straining to hear a noise that lived only in rumor. No cry echoed through the night, only the whisper of the breeze and the ice grinding against the hull. In time, a faint outline appeared in the distance. Jagged spires of ice rising from the sea. It looked like a frozen city built by some ancient race of giants. A labyrinth of icy pinnacles that towered over the waves. Euron gave the command to make for it, surmising that if an ice dragon lurked anywhere, it might claim such a fortress as its lair. Despite the gloom, there was an unnatural luminescence in those colossal structures, as though the ice itself trapped faint starlight, or perhaps some other, more eldritch radiance. Each pillar soared dozens, maybe hundreds, of feet above the water, forming an imposing barrier. Navigation became treacherous. The captain at the helm ground his teeth as he obeyed Euron's orders, weaving the silence into the labyrinth's mouth. All at once, the wind dropped, and a hush settled like a physical weight. The walls of ice on either side seemed to absorb sound, making every breath and scrape of the ship echo strangely. Snow drifted down in gentle flurries, swirling around the torches. Euron raised a hand again, signaling for absolute stillness. In that stillness, a new presence became palpable. It was a tension in the air, an unearthly energy that made the hair on the back of every neck stand. One of the men gasped. Euron could see him pressing a charm of the drowned god to his lips. They might be ironborn, but they did not belong in this realm of the frozen dead. When it came, the sound was distant and immense, an echoing rumble as if glaciers were colliding in the far distance. The men waited, hearts pounding. Then they heard another noise, closer, keening like a shriek, but impossibly low, resonating deep in the chest. Euron's grin grew feral. He had not wasted his journey. Something stirred out there, something that might confirm all of his mad hopes. He barked an order, and the silence slid further between the towering ice, each oar stroke measured and careful. The labyrinth seemed endless, turning this way and that, forcing them into narrow channels where the ship barely fit. A swirl of wind whistled past, and fragments of ice tinkled off the hull. Torches guttered. The men who rowed did so in a slow, synchronized motion, ignoring the stiffness in their limbs. No one spoke above a whisper. They felt as though they were intruding on a sacred place, or a cursed one. The air tasted of frost and dread. Euron stepped along the deck, gazing up at the tall columns, listening for the next sign. His footfalls were steady, the step of a man certain in his purpose. He whispered something under his breath, words in a foreign tongue. Maybe they were incantations, or curses, or prayers. Then at last, around a bend in the labyrinth, they emerged into a circular clearing of open water. It was enclosed on all sides by towering glacial walls, forming a great arena of ice. It was there that Euron's search bore fruit. Silhouetted against one of the walls, something gargantuan clung to the sheer, frozen cliff. In the flicker of the men's torches, it was barely discernible, a shape of pale luminescence, as if carved from the glacier itself. Then, the shape moved, spreading wings wider than any sail. A rush of displaced air slammed into the silence, nearly snuffing every torch. Men cried out, their voices hushed by terror. For a moment, Euron's single eye gleamed madly, his breath catching in his throat. This was no idle rumor, no figment of a lens-induced vision. Perched like a demon of old legends, the ice dragon stared down at them. Its eyes glowed a baleful blue-white, and the outlines of its massive body were so pale as to be nearly transparent in places. Moonlight, or some reflection of light off the ice, shimmered through its wings, accentuating the ridges of frost that bristled along its spine. It opened its jaws, revealing teeth of crystalline ice, and let out a roar that blasted the air with cold, so intense the men could feel their exposed skin begin to numb. The water around the silence crackled as a thin sheen of ice formed on the surface, radiating outward from the dragon's breath. The men fell to their knees, or clutched at the rails, their hearts pounding like drums in the deep. But Euron was not cowed. He took a step forward, lifting an arm in challenge or greeting. His voice rang out, harsh and echoing, though the words were swallowed by the immensity of this place. Perhaps the dragon recognized no language but the primal call of dominion. Still, Euron's voice broke the hush. The beast roared again, and shards of ice exploded from its maw, raining down like spears that shattered on the deck. Several men cried out as jagged fragments sliced through sails and rigging, lodging in wood with savage force. Blood sprayed as one man took a shard in the arm, but he stifled his scream under Euron's glare. Euron motioned quickly to the men below. They knew their roles, having been rehearsed in desperate secrecy. They unfurled a net made of black iron links, each link etched with runes gleaned from foreign texts. This net, Euron believed, could bind the creature if the gods favored him. The men hesitated only for the briefest moment. Then they leapt into action, hauling the net onto a ballista at the prow. The air crackled with frost as the dragon bellowed. Another hail of ice shards hammered down, and Euron's cloak flapped violently in the gust. In the swirling chaos, Euron seemed to find a terrifying calm. He barked commands with a voice filled with wild exultation. Fire the net. Anchor it. Chain the beast. Even as the men struggled, uncertain if such a feat was feasible, Euron's aura of deranged confidence goaded them on. The ballista thumped, and the net shot out, trailing a long line behind it. It soared upward, momentarily lost in the dark, before colliding with the dragon's flank. The monster's roar cracked the night. Its tail lashed, sending an avalanche of powdery snow and debris cascading down. Yet the net held, snagging on one of the creature's jagged spines. The iron links glimmered with runic inscriptions. Men scrambled to brace themselves, to pull on the line as though they could drag the beast from its perch by sheer will. For an instant, it seemed they had accomplished something unimaginable. The net's lines strained, but they did not break. A savage hiss cut through the air as the dragon twisted, glaring down with malice in its crystalline eyes. Then, it launched itself from the icy wall in a flurry of wings that cast swirling snow across the entire clearing. The silence lurched violently. Sailors shouted as they were nearly pitched overboard. Euron clutched the rail, his grin fixed, his uncovered eye gleaming with an unholy light. The creature rose, net and all, above the ship, and for a moment the men dared believe they had trapped it. But the dragon gave one mighty wrench, and the net pulled free with a snap that echoed like a thunderclap. Some runes flared in an icy glow before flickering out. Then the net went slack, plummeting into the ship's rigging with enough force to split wood. A gale-force wind whipped over the deck as the dragon soared overhead. For a heartbeat, its massive wings blotted out what little light remained. Euron bellowed an oath, demanding the men reload. But the net was tattered, the rigging a snarl of rope and iron. Sparks danced where the runes had been. One of the men shouted that they had more nets below, lesser ones that lacked the arcane symbols, but might at least slow the beast. Yet Euron did not respond, transfixed by the sight of the ice dragon's silhouette against the swirling sky. The dragon circled the clearing, a faint spectral glow emanating from its body. It unleashed another blast of frigid air, causing ice to crystallize along the ship's hull. The prow groaned as wood cracked under the sudden temperature change. Euron, however, refused to retreat or show weakness. He turned to a small chest near the helm, flipping it open with a flourish. From within, he drew an odd scepter, an ivory shaft inlaid with slivers of dragonglass, topped by what appeared to be an ancient gemstone that radiated a cold luminescence. He had bartered dearly for this artifact, traveling to distant lands and offering monstrous things in exchange. Holding it aloft, Euron began to chant in a low, guttural tone that unnerved even the most hardened of his crew. The wind swirled around him as if reacting to the power in that scepter. The gemstone glowed brighter, casting shifting patterns of light on Euron's face, so that his features appeared carved from shadow and madness. The dragon roared again, but this time, the sound seemed tinged with uncertainty. The men below, still struggling to disentangle the net, gawked at the sight of their captain chanting. A tension built in the air, an electric charge, though the cold was so intense that fingers and toes went numb. A wave of pain racked the dragon as the scepter's light pulsed, forcing the beast into a momentary retreat. It reared back, wings thrashing, and Euron let out a triumphant shout. The scepter's glow danced, flickering like pale lightning. Frost formed around Euron's boots, snaking up his legs. His breath came in labored puffs, steam rising from his mouth. It looked as though some raw magic was siphoning warmth from his very blood. Yet he kept chanting, eyes fixed upon the dragon, as though bridging the gulf between them with sheer force of will. The dragon twisted midair, letting loose a fury of icy shards. Euron brought the scepter before him, and an unnatural wind deflected the worst of the barrage. Splinters of ice hammered the deck, splintering timber and sending men sprawling. The silence trembled, but Euron stood like a pillar of defiance. He roared his own challenge, voice resonating. The gemstone flared once more, brighter, colder, and the dragon shrieked, momentarily retreating to hover at the periphery of the clearing. Euron pressed forward, leaning over the prow despite the hazard, extending the scepter as if beckoning the dragon to submit. No living creature could remain unaffected by such unnatural forces. And so, the ice dragon faltered. Its glowing eyes narrowed, a hint of confusion in their crystalline depths. For one fleeting moment, it seemed that Euron might, through whatever devil's bargain he had made, bend the beast to his will. The wind stilled as though to witness this confrontation. The men on deck stared, hardly daring to breathe. Even the injured among them lay silent, transfixed by the spectacle of a man challenging a legendary beast. Frost continued to creep up Euron's legs, but he ignored it, lost in a dark rapture, feeling the power that coursed through the artifact and into him. Then, a sudden convulsion shook the dragon's frame. Its roar turned guttural. A surge of raw energy pulsed from the creature, tearing through Euron's mystical windshield. The wave of force shattered the scepter's glow, extinguishing it with a sharp crack. Euron staggered, nearly losing his footing. Men screamed as a flurry of ice and snow hammered the deck. Sails ripped. The main mast creaked ominously. Splinters rained down like tiny knives. In a final, furious roar, the dragon flapped its wings and climbed higher, leaving behind a swirling tempest that battered the silence from every side. And then, with a single majestic sweep, the ice dragon soared out of the ice arena, vanishing over the towering walls, leaving the labyrinth in a swirl of frost and whipping wind. The men were left in stunned disarray, battered by shards of ice, their prize slipping through their grasp. Euron fell to one knee, panting, a hand braced on the railing. His single eye burned with fury and something else. He stared at the gemstone atop the scepter, now cracked, its glow sputtering. A lesser man might have felt despair or recognized his limit. But Euron Greyjoy only felt the thirst for more. More power, more dominion. His lips curled in a tremulous grin. The dragon had fled, but it had not vanished. He could still sense it, somewhere amid these frozen wastes. And now, after tasting that possibility, he would pursue it with a determination beyond sanity. Stillness settled over the battered ship. The men began to take stock, casualties, damage to the sails, the missing supplies. They waited for commands, eyes flicking nervously between Euron and the labyrinth walls. Euron slowly rose to his feet, wiping blood from a shallow cut on his forehead, the crimson stain on the back of his glove startling against the pallor of the frosted deck. He laughed, a ragged, twisted sound that echoed in the hush. Then he drew a deep breath, steadied himself, and began ordering repairs. His voice brooked no dissent. The men obeyed. For days, they remained in the labyrinth, repairing the mast, patching the hull, and searching every crevice for the sign of that monstrous shape. Euron was relentless. He demanded that the men keep a constant watch. At night, he performed strange rites by torchlight, kneeling at the prow with the scepter placed before him, chanting in tongues unknown to the Seven Kingdoms. Harsh winds whipped his hair, but he never faltered. The men could only speculate on what dreadful bargains he might be attempting. Once, a man said, he saw Euron offering up bits of his own blood, collected in a golden chalice, then pouring it over the sides of the ship in offering. The rumor spread quickly, though none dared confirm it. Most of the crew avoided Euron's gaze altogether, focusing on the tasks at hand, and clinging to the hope of survival. In these frigid days, the meager daylight never felt like true day. The sky remained a washed-out gray, the sun a pale disk that offered no warmth. The labyrinth's towering walls echoed every clang of hammer and mutter of speech. Men spoke only in low tones, as though afraid that to speak loudly might call the dragon's wrath upon them again. Euron prowled the deck like a caged wolf. He barked orders that the men rig additional ballistae, craft new nets, find more ways to restrain the beast when it appeared again. His attempts to restore the scepter's power were less fruitful. The gemstone had hairline cracks that no mortal craft could repair, and though it still glimmered faintly, it lacked the previous potency. Euron refused to concede defeat. He believed he had left a mark on the dragon, just as it had left its mark on him. Once a bond was formed, it could be manipulated. Eventually, the labyrinth grew too perilous to remain. Ice shifts threatened to entomb them, and the labyrinth itself appeared to shift with the tides, blocking passages they had once used. One morning, an enormous shelf of ice collapsed with a thunderous crash that shook the entire area, sending waves rocking the silence. That was the final sign Euron needed. He called upon the men to weigh anchor, turning the silence around to find a new path. They would not abandon the hunt, merely relocate it. Euron was confident the dragon lurked somewhere in these northern seas, and he would scour every last inch until the beast was his. Weeks passed in a haze of wind, snow, and the grinding of ice. The men muttered that the sun had forgotten them, that they had slipped into an eternal twilight. Euron drove them onward. Even the Ironborn, with their resilience and savage pride, felt the creep of despair. Food supplies grew precarious. The salted provisions had frozen solid. It took hours to chip off enough to cook into a meager stew. Drinking water was found by melting ice, which only served to remind them of their precarious surroundings. Some men grew ill, their fingers blackening from frostbite. Euron's wrath fell upon them if they complained too loudly or failed to fulfill their duties. The air was filled with the smell of blood and boiling pitch as they made desperate repairs, day after day. At night, Euron's nightmares became common knowledge among the crew. They heard him screaming at unseen presences, cursing or praising unknown gods. One night, a deckhand swore he saw a bluish glow emanating from Euron's cabin, seeping through the cracks of the door. Murmurs spread. The captain had conjured something foul that prowled the corridors. Yet no one dared investigate too closely. Euron emerged in the mornings more determined, sporting deeper shadows under his single eye. He would sneer at the men's fearful glances. Whatever haunted him, he used it as fuel. A faint hope appeared one day when they spotted what seemed like an open sea to the west, free of ice for several miles. The men cheered, if only because it offered a chance to navigate more safely. Euron too saw the advantage of open water, though he gave no sign of relief. They steered the silence into those clearer waters, finding the going less hazardous. The biting wind persisted, but the ship no longer had to skirt so many icebergs, which allowed them to move faster. Euron took advantage of this relative ease to plan anew. He questioned the survivors of every port raid he had conducted in the past, gleaning scraps of rumor about the far north, about hidden caverns or stony isles where a dragon might nest. He combined these half-truths into a map that existed mostly in his mind. And with every hour of travel, he kept his senses peeled for that presence, that hum in the air that he swore he could detect. The mark between him and the dragon, or so he believed, endured, faint as a dying ember, but still aglow. Finally, on a day when low clouds hung overhead, as if pregnant with snow, they spotted land in the distance, an iron coast of jagged cliffs and snowy peaks, battered by endless waves. Euron steered the silence toward it, curious if the dragon might have taken roost amid those heights. As the ship drew closer, they realized the cliffs were honeycombed with caves large enough to swallow entire buildings. Ice and snow clung to every ledge, forming frozen waterfalls that hung like tapestries of glass. Gulls circled overhead, though they were smaller and more ragged than the gulls of warmer shores. Euron studied the cliffs, scanning for any sign of that pale, colossal shape. They found a sheltered cove, ringed by tall rocks, where the ship could anchor without risk of the hull being crushed by drifting ice. Euron ordered a shore party to assemble. Dozens of men with grappling hooks, torches, nets, and the strongest crossbows the silence possessed. He insisted on leading them himself. At his side, he carried the cracked scepter and a curved sword, its hilt inlaid with shards of obsidian. The men followed, though every single one bore the look of a condemned prisoner. If a monstrous ice dragon waited in some cavern, they knew their chances of survival were thin. But Euron's will overshadowed their fears. He promised them the greatest spoils imaginable if they succeeded. They came ashore on a small, pebbled beach. The tide had receded, leaving a band of slick stones that gleamed like polished onyx under the gray sky. The wind snarled through the rocks, carrying the tang of brine and the biting cold of snow. Euron led them onward, stepping with eerie confidence. They climbed past the initial slope of rocks and ice, finding themselves standing at the base of a cliff that soared so high it vanished into the low clouds. A battered path wound upward, narrow and treacherous, carved by nature's slow erosion. Snow clung to its edges, threatening to send the unwary tumbling to a swift death. Euron gestured for them to ascend. He took the lead, scepter in one hand, sword strapped at his side. Torchbearers followed, carefully lighting the way. Their breath plumed in front of their faces. The path forced them single file, so no large group could move side by side. The wind battered them from the open sea below, sending loose bits of ice swirling around their legs. Euron pressed on, face set in grim determination. He occasionally paused, craning his head as though listening. The men behind huddled closer, terrified that some gargantuan white shape might descend upon them. At last, they reached the entrance of a cave that yawned before them. It was large enough for two men on horseback to ride side by side with room to spare. Stalactites of ice hung from its roof like frozen fangs. A dark corridor stretched beyond. The men paused, exchanging uneasy looks. Euron motioned them forward without hesitation. Their footsteps echoed, torchlight flickering across icy walls. The deeper they ventured, the colder the air grew, until it seemed they were inhaling shards of glass. Some men coughed, their lungs burning. Euron ignored their discomfort. He could sense something in the bowels of the rock, some stirring presence that resonated with his half-broken scepter. Frost glistened on every surface. They wended their way through corridors that widened and narrowed unpredictably. Twice, the men had to squeeze through tight passages, one by one, passing equipment forward. The sense of claustrophobia was palpable, though Euron pressed relentlessly ahead. Torchlight revealed occasional markings on the walls, strange gouges, as if left by massive claws. The tension in the group mounted. Each man listened for the slightest sound beyond their own breath, and the drip of melting ice. Then, they turned a corner into a massive chamber that took their breath away. It was an underground cavern so vast that their torchlight barely illuminated its edges. Giant columns of ice rose from the floor to the ceiling, forming natural pillars. The floor was a slick sheet of ice, reflecting the torches in an otherworldly glow. And at the center of that chamber lay a sight that made the men's hearts pound in their chests. A mound of shattered ice that glittered faintly, arranged as if some enormous creature had formed a makeshift nest. And though the shape was partially hidden by a fallen column of stone and ice, they could see the outlines of enormous wings folded at rest. The ice dragon was there, half in slumber or perhaps weakened from its earlier conflict. Its massive flanks rose and fell with each breath, emanating a soft, ghostly light. Euron Greyjoy's lips parted in a silent expression of triumph. He motioned for absolute silence. Slowly, ever so slowly, they crept closer. Each footstep carefully placed. The dragon's breath filled the cavern with a faint hum, a gentle ripple in the air that caused the torches to flicker. It was an ominous lullaby. Euron's scepter glimmered faintly, responding to the dragon's proximity. One misstep, one clatter, and the beast could awaken in fury. Yet Euron dared not waste the chance. He gestured for the men to begin deploying their equipment, to circle around, carefully unrolling the new nets. He himself advanced, step by step, eyes locked on the creature's head, which was turned slightly away from them. Each breath from the dragon caused a fine mist of frost to rise around its nostrils. It was wounded, Euron realized, spotting a jagged tear near one of its wings. Possibly the runic net had inflicted some harm after all. If the beast was weakened, then this was his moment. The men worked with trembling hands, placing heavy hooks around columns of ice, preparing to anchor the net that would, in theory, ensnare the beast. Every creak of rope sounded like thunder in that stillness. Euron inched closer, scepter in hand. He began murmuring the same incantations as before, but softly, as if coaxing the beast rather than challenging it. The gem flickered, responding to some synergy with the dragon's presence. The air tingled, and the men felt it on their skin, raising gooseflesh despite the cold. Every breath came shallow. Then, a single misstep shattered the moment. A man stumbled on the slick ice, falling heavily onto a chunk of frozen rock. The sound reverberated like a hammer strike. Instantly, the dragon stirred. Its colossal head lifted, eyes snapping open. Those crystalline orbs glowed with malevolent awareness, focusing on the intruders. Men cursed under their breath, desperately trying to pull the net taut, to catch the beast off guard. But the dragon rose with a speed that belied its size, letting out a roar that slammed through the cavern. The wave of cold that followed extinguished half the torches. Shards of ice exploded from the creature's maw, scything through the air. Men screamed as the shards struck, leaving some pinned to the ice, their blood staining the pale floor. Euron staggered backward, momentarily blinded by swirling snow. His heart pounded, but fear had no hold on him. Instead, he raised the scepter, howling his incantations in a desperate attempt to reassert the tenuous connection. The gem flared, warring with the dragon's own frigid fury. The creature shrieked, lashing its tail, smashing the fragile columns around it. Chunks of ice collapsed, crashing onto the men. Still, they fought to haul the net overhead, to trap the dragon beneath its iron links. Chaos reigned as roars clashed with the men's shouts, as the net soared in a wide arc, shimmering in the dying torchlight. In a miraculous feat of coordination, the men managed to cast the net across the dragon's back. Hooks latched onto the beast's scales. The dragon twisted, wings thrashing, smashing aside columns with savage ease. The floor quaked. A swirl of razor-sharp icicles showered down upon the men, forcing them to shield their eyes with their arms. Euron, near the creature's foreleg, bellowed for them to pull. The rope lines tightened, anchored to pillars. The net strained. The dragon let out a spine-tingling wail that reverberated through the chamber. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed. The beast could not fully spread its wings, pinned as they were beneath the net. It flailed, sinking its claws into the ice. Euron advanced, scepter raised, chanting. The gem flared once more, connecting with the creature's luminous eyes. A swirl of ice crystals enveloped them, dancing in the air like fragments of a shattered mirror. Euron could feel the dragon's rage, its primal terror, coursing through him. His own mind teetered at the edge of that psychic abyss. Yet the net held, for now. As the men strained at the ropes, the dragon reared up, hooking a claw into one of the columns that anchored the net. With a sickening crunch, it wrenched the column from the floor. Ice cracked, huge slabs peeling away. The ceiling groaned. A portion of the cavern roof collapsed, sending blocks of ice tumbling down in a deadly cascade. Screams echoed, drowned out by the roar of destruction. Euron barely leapt aside, narrowly avoiding a hunk of ice that would have crushed him. The cavern reeled, and gloom descended, as the partial collapse smothered what little torchlight remained. The dragon, in a final surge of desperate might, ripped free of the net. Iron links snapped, the runes flaring and dying. The men were thrown off their feet by the force of the dragon's thrashing wings. A whirlwind of snow and debris swallowed everything in sight. Euron found himself tumbling across the ice, losing his grip on the scepter. Sparks flew as the gemstone struck the floor, fracturing further. Smoke or steam rose from it, though in the swirling chaos it was hard to tell which. By the time Euron regained his footing, half buried under shards of ice, he saw the dragon bounding toward the newly opened gap in the cavern's roof. It struggled, fighting through the net's remnants that still clung to its spines. With a guttural roar, the beast launched itself skyward, disappearing into the swirling snow. A sudden rush of frigid air followed in its wake. Men lay strewn across the chamber, some moaning in pain, others unmoving. Euron stood in the half-darkness, chest heaving, a raw fury twisting his features. The scepter lay at his feet, its gem nearly dark, lifeless. Another failure, but not a final defeat. He was too blinded by ambition to consider that possibility. Eventually, the survivors scrambled to aid one another. They lit fresh torches, their faces ashen with terror and exhaustion. Euron stared at the spot where the dragon had vanished, then at the ruined net, the collapsed pillars, the broken scepter. He let out a roar of primal rage that echoed through the icebound corridors. Even so, behind the madness in his eye flickered a fierce, unyielding determination. He knew, now beyond any doubt, that he could not abandon this quest. The beast was real, formidable beyond measure, but it also bore scars from their encounters. In time, with the right strategy or artifact, Euron believed he could subjugate it, and with such a monster under his command, he would march on the north and beyond, encasing the world in dread. The men, battered and bloodied, could barely stand. Some had lost limbs to the dragon's shards. Others had ribs cracked by falling ice. Euron's own body ached from bruises and cuts. But none of that stopped him from leading them back through the twisting corridors, forcing them to make their way to the surface. The climb down was perilous, made worse by the swirling wind and failing light. By the time they reached the cove, night had fallen in earnest, though it was hard to tell given how little daylight this far north ever provided. They found the silence bobbing in the dark waters, a small beacon of safety in a land that offered no mercy. They hauled themselves aboard, collapsing in heaps. No one dared speak of mutiny in that moment, though the seeds of resentment and despair surely lodged in their hearts. Euron alone seemed possessed of inexhaustible tenacity. He paced the deck, ignoring his own wounds, stopping only to gulp wine from a large skin. His mind raced with new plans, new ideas to entrap the dragon. Secretly, he toyed with the notion of forging an alliance with powers in the far north, rumored entities beyond the wall. If such beings even existed, he might parley with them, trade something vile for the knowledge to bring the dragon to heel. For he saw it in his dreams, an unstoppable beast of ice and frost, with him astride it, descending upon Winterfell in a maelstrom of shimmering wings and lethal breath. He saw banners frozen in place, armies turned to statues of ice, lords bowing to him in abject terror. But that was for the future. For now, the men lay trembling in the aftermath of their second failed attempt. Euron set the course anew, determined to roam the northern seas until the beast was found. He ordered lookouts posted day and night, scanning the horizon for that pale shape. Meanwhile, he locked himself in his cabin with the remnants of his scepter, performing rituals that caused strange lights to leak from beneath the door. No man dared disturb him, though some whispered that they heard chanting in languages older than the first men. Days dragged into weeks. They skirted the shattered edges of pack ice, forging westward, sometimes doubling back east, never resting for long. The men had begun to look like specters themselves, gaunt, hollow-eyed, haunted. Food ran perilously low. More than once, they were forced to hack chunks of ice to melt for water. The dryness of their throats and the chill in their bones became a constant torment, yet Euron's iron will drove them forward. He rationed out small victories in the form of loot from unsuspecting whaling ships they occasionally encountered. None dared stand against the silence in these waters. Euron seized their provisions, taking them as spoils for his battered crew, then leaving the captives to the mercy of the icy waves. Still, the dragon evaded them. At times they spotted shapes in the distance that might have been illusions. Flickers of white in the sky, or strange reflections off icebergs. Each time, Euron rallied the men to chase, but they never found anything substantial. The cold grew sharper, as though the season itself stretched deeper into a frozen hell. Gales battered the silence, threatening to capsize her. The men prayed for the old gods and the new, for the drowned god, for any deity that might spare them from this relentless quest. But Euron pressed on, filling the nights with savage mutterings to the broken scepter, as if coaxing out its last remnants of power. Whenever it flickered, even faintly, he took it as a sign that the bond was not severed. One dreary afternoon, as the pale sun drifted behind swirling clouds, a roar echoed across the waters. At once, men scrambled to the railings, eyes wide. Euron dashed out from his cabin, cloak billowing behind him. There, above them, soared a shape of nightmare and wonder. The ice dragon, its wings catching the feeble light, its luminous scales glimmering. And upon its flank, the men could see old wounds, the net scars etched like thunderbolts of frost across its flesh. For one suspended moment, Euron and the beast locked gazes across the expanse of sky. The dragon's roar vibrated the air, blasting the sails with a rush of freezing wind. Men cried out, ducking behind the bulwarks. Ice began to form on the deck, layering the rigging in an instant. Euron, undeterred, staggered to the prow, scepter in hand, brandishing it with all the fanatical devotion he could muster. His chanting returned, a guttural invocation that reverberated in his chest. The cracked gem flickered in response, though faintly. The dragon circled overhead, hissing, its breath swirling in a cloud of pale mist. It seemed uncertain whether to attack or flee. Euron, seizing the moment, shouted for the men to ready their weapons. No, not this time. Those had been lost or ruined. He intended something else, some plan born of the feverish nights he had spent locked in his cabin. The men obeyed, though terror drained the blood from their faces. Crossbowmen took positions, waiting for Euron's signal. Another roar, deafening. The deck trembled under the force of the dragon's presence. Frost crackled across the planks. Euron lifted the scepter, chanting. The gem's light pulsed once, twice, in tune with the creature's labored breathing. Then, in a decisive movement, the dragon turned its gargantuan head toward Euron, jaws parting to unleash a cone of freezing breath. Men screamed, dropping their crossbows to throw themselves flat. Euron twisted aside at the last heartbeat, though the fringe of his cloak froze and shattered, leaving him half spun on the deck. He regained his footing and snarled an oath, ignoring the shards of ice that scored his cheek. He howled for the men to fire. A volley of iron-tipped bolts streaked skyward, some glancing off the dragon's scales, others lodging in its translucent wing membrane. The beast roared in fury, banking sharply, nearly dropping low enough to crush the silence with its sheer bulk. The wind whipped salt spray high, mixing with shards of ice. Euron brandished the scepter again, but the gem's glow was sporadic, unreliable. The connection, if it existed, was too tenuous. The dragon was no mindless beast to be easily enthralled. It was a primal force of winter, a relic of an older world. In that furious standoff, the men realized their mortal limits. They were ironborn, proud and savage, but no match for a creature that could freeze flesh in an instant or summon storms with a beat of its wings. Yet Euron roared defiance at the heavens themselves. He commanded one final barrage. Bolts rained upward, a desperate attempt to blind or cripple the beast. One bolt struck near the creature's throat, and a gout of frigid ichor splattered the deck. The dragon shrieked, rearing back. Euron seized that moment of pain to attempt one last incantation. He gripped the scepter in both hands, chanting words that twisted the air around him. But the gem cracked fully under the strain, turning dark, the flicker of light dying. Whatever channel Euron had opened to the beast dissolved in an instant. The dragon, enraged and wounded, bellowed a fury that shook the rigging, nearly toppling the main mast. Euron glared upward, frustration etched in every line of his face. He had come so far, sacrificed so much, only to see his one hold over the dragon collapse in his hands. The monster unleashed another blast of freezing breath, sweeping across the deck. Men within its path cried out as frost enveloped them, leaving them statue-like in horrifying poses, their last moments frozen in place. The horror was unspeakable. Realizing the hopelessness of further confrontation, Euron finally snarled an order for a retreat. The men needed no second bidding. They struggled to turn the silence, battered and half-frozen, away from the monstrous shape. Rigging snapped, sails shredded. The dragon hovered overhead, exhaling one last gust of bitter wind. Then it turned, wounded and bleeding from the bolts in its flesh, and vanished into the storm-laden clouds, leaving only swirling snow and the moans of the dying behind it. Thus, Euron's third direct clash with the ice dragon ended in disaster. The deck lay littered with the frozen corpses of men who had served him loyally or out of terror. The living cowered near the rails, trembling. Ice coated everything, from the mast to the lines. The ship groaned as though alive and in pain. And at the center of it all stood Euron Greyjoy, fists clenched around the broken scepter. His face twisted with fury, but behind it lurked a glimmer of awe, and perhaps a sliver of grudging respect for the indomitable creature that had eluded his dominion. Blood trickled from a cut on his lip. He spat, the bright red staining the icy deck. Without a word, he stalked back to the helm, dismissing the dead with a single glance. If the men expected him to call off this suicidal chase, they were sorely mistaken. He would find a new way. Perhaps he would roam south again, to the sorcerers of Korth, or the mystics of Ashai, in search of a relic strong enough to bind an ice dragon. Or perhaps he would seek an alliance with whatever dark powers lurked beyond the wall. One way or another, Euron Greyjoy would not be denied. The battered Silence limped away from that frigid battleground, trailing broken rigging, her hull encrusted with ice. The living men aboard nursed injuries and an abiding sense of terror. The quest had become an obsession that consumed their captain. Yet not one dared stand against him. As a pale twilight descended, Euron stood at the prow, gazing into the endless northern wastes. In his ears, the roar of the ice dragon echoed still, a call that beckoned him onward into nightmares yet to come. He mouthed the silent promise to the horizon. He would have the beast or die in the attempt, and if he claimed it, he would bring an unholy winter to the north, a storm the likes of which the Seven Kingdoms had never known. Even the dread of the others would pale beside Euron Greyjoy, astride a living gale of frost and death. So the Silence sailed on, deeper into the realm of ice, leaving behind a trail of blood and broken hopes, accompanied only by the howling wind and the tormented dreams of a man whose ambition knew no bound. The sea stretched before them, dark and lethal, with faint whispers of ice shifting in the distance. In that shadowy domain, Euron's men huddled against the cold, casting furtive glances at their maddened captain, each of them wondering whether they had strayed beyond the reach of any god. Day after day, the wind carried phantom roars and fleeting glimpses of white shapes in the sky, tormenting them with the specter of a foe that refused to be tamed. Still, Euron did not waver. He had faced the beast thrice and lived. To him, that was proof enough of his singular fate. He was certain that eventually he would find the key to enslaving the dragon's power. If mortal men had once bent fire-breathing dragons to their will in old Valyria, then surely he, Euron Greyjoy, the Crow's Eye, could tame this primal engine of frost. And as long as even one man followed him, as long as the Silence remained afloat, his pursuit would continue. The North would remain unaware, for now, of the doom that might someday descend upon it. Yet in the swirling winds of the deep north, a dark prophecy gathered, born of a man's relentless ambition and a creature that soared on wings of rime and shadow. The next day dawned in a haze of swirling gray, the sun smothered behind iron clouds. The Silence drifted in a patch of open water, surrounded by an unending field of ice floes. Euron emerged from his cabin, the broken scepter tucked away somewhere hidden. His men observed him with wary eyes. They were not sure what new orders might come, what new insanity might seize their captain. Yet Euron's face was calm, almost serene. Without a word, he climbed to the forecastle and stared across the frigid sea. He could hear the faint groans of shifting ice, the breath of the wind, and somewhere out there, the beating heart of the ice dragon. He let the Silence stretch, as if listening for the creature's presence. Then a savage grin curved across his lips. He turned to his crew, raising his arms to the gray sky as if in benediction or curse. The wind whipped his hair, revealing the patch over his left eye and the piercing blue of his right. His voice carried across the deck, low and resonant, commanding every man's attention. If they expected an end to their ordeal, they were sorely disappointed. His words dripped with ambition, with the promise of unimaginable power just within reach. The dragon was close. He could feel it in his blood. They would mend the sails, restock the provisions when next they found a vulnerable vessel, and venture once more into the heart of the North to claim what was rightfully his. A few men exchanged stricken looks, but none dared speak against him. Their fates were bound now to a creature of their own making, a captain whose lust for domination eclipsed even the terrors of an ancient and unearthly beast. Euron's laughter pealed across the deck, echoing over the ice floes. And so the silence continued its odyssey, bearing a captain and crew locked in a grim dance with an ice dragon, bound by blood, runes, and a longing for conquest that transcended mortal reason. The wind shrieked across the lonely seas, carrying the promise that one day Euron's mad dream might indeed scourge the north, leaving only a frozen legend in its wake. Euron Greyjoy's mood cast its shadow across the silence like a malignant spirit. Though he stood at the prow, still as a carved idol, his presence infected the very timbers beneath his boots. His single uncovered eye fixed on the leaden sky, where clouds pressed so low one might believe the heavens themselves sought to drown the world in ice. Behind him, what remained of his crew moved in grim, weary motions, men reduced to half-living shades by the unrelenting cold and the terrors of the north. Their breath showed in rapid bursts, their cheeks wind-burnt and raw. Each man, in the privacy of his thoughts, wondered how much longer they could endure such a doomed pursuit. In the days since the Ice Dragon's last savage assault, the ship had become a floating mausoleum for men who had once called themselves proud Ironborn. Half-frozen corpses still littered the lower hold. Euron, in his blackest of moods, would not permit precious time spent on a burial at sea. Their bodies remained, drifting in and out of sight, with the sway of the ship. Pale faces turned to the planks above them. The men who survived avoided that part of the hold. The stench of death lay thick, though the cold slowed the rot, preserving a grim tableau of agony. Some whispered that the dead stared with accusing eyes, while others swore they had heard faint rattling moans. Yet the living had no refuge from the horrors that pressed upon them, for if they dared set foot above decks, they faced the punishing winds and the glare of their captain. Yet still Euron offered them no respite. Their rations, already thin, grew more precarious by the day. The store of fresh water, melted from ice floes, had to be boiled over fires that struggled to stay lit under the constant gale. Men took shifts at the pump, for the battered hull had begun to leak in places. Fingers blackened with frostbite on the long nights, when the temperature plunged below what any civilized region might endure. Yet Euron refused to let them turn south for warmer waters or more plentiful supplies. His obsession burned, furious as a star going supernova. One glimpse of that pale behemoth in the skies, one fleeting chance to make it his, would be worth any price. Or so he told himself, speaking in half-crazed monologues behind the closed door of his cabin. He seemed to need less sleep than a normal man. While the rest of the crew staggered through their shifts, Euron prowled the ship at all hours, glaring at the horizon as though he might summon the ice dragon through force of will alone. He would pause sometimes, lifting a wineskin to his lips and letting crimson dribbles roll down his chin. His single eye was shot with veins of red, as if haunted by ghosts he could not name. Occasionally he would vanish into his cabin for hours, only to emerge carrying scrolls penned in languages none of the men recognized. Within that claustrophobic space, beyond the threshold, flickers of strange luminescent color could sometimes be glimpsed by those bold enough to approach. Muffled chanting filled the corridors and unsettled the men's dreams. One frigid dawn, as the sky bruised to a violent purple, a shape appeared on the horizon. A jagged silhouette that might have been a small island, or perhaps an iceberg so colossal it resembled land. Euron ordered the helmsman to steer for it, though the sea between them bristled with ice shards. The men prepared for the possibility that the floes would slice their hull to ribbons. But Euron refused caution. They had no choice but to comply, weaving a precarious course forward. As they drew nearer, it became clear that this was indeed an island, albeit one crowned with ice-crusted rocks that jutted in unnatural spires. Huge flocks of seabirds circled overhead, their cries thin and distant, carried on the wind. Euron's gaze sharpened when he caught sight of a ruined structure perched upon one of the slopes, a few crumbling walls, half buried under drifts of snow, and a tower that rose at a precarious slant. Whoever had built it, or why, remained a mystery. This far north, few men dared to settle on land that might shift beneath relentless tides and winter storms. But Euron was nothing if not curious, especially when it came to any potential vantage point from which to watch the skies for that elusive beast. He gave the order to make landfall. The men scrambled, dropping the anchor in a small cove where the shoreline was formed by broken shards of rock. Boats were lowered, and Euron himself led the expedition onto the beach. The salt spray froze on their beards as they rowed, each man casting wary glances at the cliffs overhead, as though expecting to see monstrous wings blot out the light. When they reached shore, they waded through water so cold it burned like acid. The gravelly beach gave way to a steep path carved by timed storms, winding up toward the crumbling tower. Euron led the way, cloak snapping in the wind, the patch over his left eye as dark as a bottomless pit. His boots crunched over layers of frozen seaweed and broken shells. Behind him, his men carried torches, though the light was feeble in the half-gloom of this perpetual twilight. Seabirds flapped overhead, squawking as if in mockery. They ascended carefully. More than once, a man slipped on the icy rocks, nearly tumbling to his death. Euron did not wait for them, climbing at a steady pace. His breath fogged the air, and frost clung to the edges of his cloak. At last, they emerged onto a plateau where the ruined structure stood. The walls, built of black stone shot with veins of quartz, were half collapsed, and the single tower slanted like a broken fang. Snow dusted the interior, forming drifts in corners. Here and there, remnants of rotted wood jutted from the rubble, evidence of a roof long gone. A few rusted tools lay scattered, half buried by time. The place seemed utterly abandoned. Yet Euron, pacing around the perimeter, appeared intrigued. Perhaps he sensed something intangible in the wind or in the stones themselves. He motioned the men to search the area, to pry up old floorboards or dig through drifts. They obeyed grudgingly. Anything of value had likely been looted decades or centuries ago. Still, Euron insisted. A few men discovered a rickety staircase leading down into what might have been a cellar. The opening yawned with darkness. Euron descended without hesitation, torch in hand. The steps were narrow and slick. Behind him, 2 of his men followed, hearts hammering in their chests. The rest remained above, sifting through rubble, muttering complaints. Below, the cellar proved more extensive than expected. A low corridor branched off in multiple directions, many half-collapsed. The stones here were damp and slick with ice, reflecting the torchlight in uneven glimmers. Euron led, pressing deeper, ignoring the caution of his men. The corridor twisted. Twice they had to squeeze through narrow gaps. The air smelled stale, like a tomb, and the faint drip of water echoed somewhere ahead. At last, they came upon a larger chamber with a vaulted ceiling. Icicles hung like crystalline chandeliers. In the center lay a circle of stone pillars, each etched with primitive symbols. Euron paused. Eyes narrowed as the torchlight revealed strange carvings. He knelt to examine them, figures that resembled men, though hunched and bestial, apparently worshipping something that soared above them. The carvings were crude, yet the outline of wings was undeniable. His men shifted uneasily, mindful of how the flickering light cast monstrous shadows. Euron brushed a gloved hand over the grooves. Some of the lines seemed fresh, as though carved not too many years past. He could almost imagine a gathering of wild devotees, chanting in this subterranean space, calling upon an ancient creature of ice to descend. Perhaps they had tried to placate or worship a being akin to the ice dragon he now pursued. He closed his eye for a moment, exhaling. A sense of raw possibility surged through him. If the makers of these carvings had harnessed even a fraction of the dragon's power, there might be relics or knowledge left behind. He rose and paced around the circle, torch trailing sparks as it passed. At the far side of the chamber, a stone archway beckoned. He approached, and the men behind him hesitated. The arch was partially caved in, leaving a gap just wide enough for a man to slip through. Euron thrust his torch inside, glimpsing a narrow passage. Without waiting, he turned sideways and squeezed through, ignoring the scrape of jagged stone. His men cursed quietly but followed, unwilling to let him venture alone. The new corridor sloped downward. The walls wept trickles of freezing water, forming shallow pools on the floor. The air grew colder, if that were possible, and their breaths plumed in ghostly shapes. They emerged into a smaller chamber, barely tall enough for them to stand upright. The walls were smooth rock, and the floor was worn into a shallow bowl shape. At the center lay a block of stone, perhaps an altar, upon which something gleamed in the torchlight. A cluster of pale crystals, arranged in what looked like a claw. Euron strode forward, transfixed. The crystals caught the light, refracting pale rainbows across the walls. He ran a hand above them, feeling a chill emanate from within. Closer inspection revealed it was indeed carved in the likeness of a great talon, each claw tip ending in a spear-like shard. The stone beneath it was intricately carved with swirling patterns, reminiscent of wind or water. The men exchanged looks. The sculpture radiated an uncanny aura, as if it siphoned warmth from the air. Frost rimed its edges. Euron lifted his torch overhead, studying it from all angles. Slowly, almost reverently, he extended a hand to touch the central crystal. His fingertips tingled upon contact, a freezing burn that momentarily shocked him. Yet he did not withdraw. Instead, he set the torch aside and gripped the largest shard with his bare hand. The cold bit cruelly, but he closed his eyes and uttered something. Perhaps a prayer to no god they knew. The men watched in astonishment as a thin trail of vapor curled around his wrist. He let out a small gasp, then his lips twitched in a wild grin. A moment later, he pulled his hand back. Blood trickled from the deep gash in his palm, sliced by the crystal's razor edge. It dripped onto the altar, each crimson drop sizzling against the stone. Euron inhaled sharply. His pupils were wide, his expression suffused with feverish intensity. He rummaged in his coat and removed a scrap of cloth, binding his wound with quick efficiency. The men said nothing, nor did they dare question him, even as they noted how the crystals seemed to faintly glow where his blood had touched. At last, Euron tore his gaze away from the object. He glanced at his men, face ashen but alive, with some new fervor. Without a word, he lifted the sculpture from the altar. It was heavier than it appeared, yet he cradled it to his chest. A hush fell. The men seemed afraid to breathe, as though any sound might awaken the presence that lingered in the stone. Euron looked back at them with a smirk that bordered on mania. Then he gestured for them to return the way they had come. They obeyed, hearts hammering, their torches sputtering in the stale air. Re-emerging into the vaulted chamber, they traced their path back to the staircase, ignoring the oppressive sense that the shadows themselves reached for them. At one point, the corridor narrowed, forcing the men to pause. Euron shoved the object ahead, careful not to drop it, then squeezed through after it. Eventually, they climbed the steps and emerged once more into the surface world, where the wind howled across the ruins. The rest of the men there had grown bored or uneasy in their search of the crumbling tower. Finding nothing but half-rotted beams and a scattering of broken pottery, they watched with alarm as Euron appeared, clutching something in his arms. Not a man among them dared to question him. They descended back to the beach, where the longboats waited. Euron kept the sculpture close, heedless of the blood that seeped through his bandage. His features were set in a triumphant cast. As the men rowed back to the silence, the gloom of the sky deepened, and snow began to fall in thin flurries. By the time they reached the ship, the deck was already dusted with icy crystals. Euron strode to his cabin without a word, brushing off any attempts by the men to ask about his find. The door slammed behind him, leaving the crew to share apprehensive looks. Whatever new madness Euron had uncovered, it would bind them tighter into his web of ambition. For the remainder of that day, Euron did not emerge. Muffled chanting again seeped through the timbers. Light flickered beneath the cabin door, dancing with strange prismatic hues. The men busied themselves maintaining the rigging, scraping ice from the rails, or rationing out the last of their meager stores. Night fell, enveloping the ship in darkness. The occasional shriek of wind through the sails was all that broke the silence. Yet none could dismiss the sensation that something had changed, that in the bowels of the ship, Euron communed with a relic of the North that might rival the powers he had once tried to harness with his shattered scepter. Near midnight, those on deck jolted at the sound of distant roaring. Hearts hammered in their chests, for they had learned that such a roar might herald the ice dragon. Hastily they looked skyward, but the clouds made it impossible to see anything. Only the frantic scuttling of footsteps and the creak of rigging betrayed their anxiety. If the dragon were near, Euron would want to know. A handful of men approached his cabin, but they paused, hesitant, for Euron had made it clear he was not to be disturbed except in matters of utmost urgency. The roar sounded again, fainter this time, as though it receded into the gloom. Torn between fear of the dragon and fear of their captain's wrath, they lingered for a moment. Ultimately, a gray-bearded deckhand swallowed his dread and rapped on the cabin door. At first there was no answer, only the crackle of something inside. Then, Euron's voice sliced through the silence, commanding them to speak. The deckhand informed him of the noise, trembling. Euron opened the door a crack, revealing his face bathed in a strange pale glow that emanated from within. He listened, face unreadable. Then he nodded, eyes flicking to the swirling darkness beyond. He stepped out, shutting the door behind him, though the men noticed he locked it with a key. They saw no sign of the sculpture in his hands, but the faint luminescence clung to his coat, a fleeting shimmer that made their hair stand on end. Euron crossed to the prow, ignoring the questions that hovered on the men's lips. He peered into the night, as though his vision could pierce the thick veil of snow and cloud. The sea moved in black swells, dotted with shards of ice that caught the faint starlight. The roar did not repeat. After several tense minutes, Euron let out a low hiss. Half anger, half hunger for what he'd hoped to see. Perhaps the dragon had only circled at a distance, or perhaps it was some other monstrous beast that dwelled in these waters. Whatever it was, it had melted back into silence. Euron spat over the side, his breath leaving a cloud in the cold air. Then, with a curt order for the men to keep watch, he returned to his cabin, slamming the door. No one dared follow. Sleep that night was fitful for everyone. The men huddled in the forecastle, drawing lots for the few warm furs that remained. In the gloom, they murmured anxieties, recalling the times the dragon had come upon them unawares. Fear pulsed in their veins. They wished, however faintly, that Euron would relent, that he would allow them to sail south once more, or at least find a harbor with some chance of survival. But none among them held illusions that he would yield. The next day arrived in a pallid hush, as if reluctant to show itself. The clouds parted just enough to reveal a pale sky. When Euron reappeared, he seemed changed in subtle ways. There was a tightness around his mouth, a deeper mania in his eye. He called the men together and announced that they would sail due east. A rumor gleaned from ragged maps spoke of a treacherous strait there, beyond which lay waters no sensible captain would dare navigate. And that was precisely why Euron believed the dragon might lurk in that domain. They set sail, the silence cutting through the waves with a creaking defiance. The labyrinth of icebergs grew thicker as they advanced. More than once, the watch in the crow's nest cried warning, and the helmsman swung the rudder hard, narrowly avoiding a calamitous collision. The men worked feverishly, pushing their numb limbs to the brink. Euron oversaw everything, hands clasped behind his back, cloak fluttering. In quieter moments, they saw him slip below deck, returning moments later with eyes lit by that eerie shimmer. The voyage became a living nightmare of cold and uncertainty. Days blurred into nights. The storms that assailed them carried sleet and hail that rattled against the sails like a rain of arrows. The rigging froze so solid the men had to hack at it with knives just to adjust the sails. Sleep offered little relief, as the howling of the wind seeped into their dreams. Some men wept silently in their hammocks, though none dared let Euron witness such weakness. A few tried to slip away in a stolen dinghy, but the savage sea devoured them before they could vanish. The next morning, Euron said nothing of the attempt. Perhaps he found it too trivial to bother with. His mind was fixed solely on the unimaginable goal that had drawn him here. One afternoon, a break in the clouds revealed a swath of pale sunlight that gleamed off the water, momentarily blinding those who were unused to brightness. Euron squinted, scanning the horizon. One of the men rushed to the railing and shouted, pointing east. At first it seemed to be another berg, but as the glare subsided, they saw it was a colossal spire of stone protruding from the ocean. The spire stood like a black fang encased in ice, rising hundreds of feet above the waves. A shelf of ice at its base hinted at some sort of frozen plateau. Euron bellowed for the helmsman to steer toward it. His heart drummed in his chest with renewed excitement. This spire might serve as a vantage point for spotting the dragon. Failing that, it was at least a potential landmark to explore. The men obeyed, though with fatalistic dread. Reaching the spire proved no simple feat. A ring of jagged ice floes surrounded it, shifting unpredictably in the currents. More than once, the Silence's hull scraped against submerged shards with a sickening crunch. Men scrambled to mend leaks in real time, wadding cloth and pitch into the breaches. At last they found a narrow channel through the ice. The spire's immense bulk loomed over them, blocking out what remained of the sunlight. Euron ordered a landing party to prepare. He would go ashore again, taking ropes and climbing gear. Perhaps there was a path up the spire, or cracks they could exploit. He wanted to see what lay atop that plateau of ice. Numb-limbed men lowered a longboat. Euron descended with them, sword at his hip, the shape of some hidden object beneath his cloak. They rowed carefully, the boat rocking among drifting chunks of ice. The spire's base was an uneven shelf, slick with frozen spray, battered by waves. Carefully, they timed their approach with each swell, managing to land without capsizing. The men jumped from the boat onto the shelf, hauling it out of the water to avoid being dashed against the rocks. Snow crunched underfoot. The spire's dark stone soared overhead, marked by striations of white frost. Euron surveyed the surface. He found a natural fissure in the rock face, large enough for men to climb if they used grapnels and hammered pitons. He ordered them to begin at once. Some men balked. These were not skilled mountaineers, but hardened sailors who had never dreamt of scaling an ice-slick cliff. But Euron allowed no argument. He thrust a coil of rope into one man's arms and pointed at the fissure. Reluctantly, the man began to climb. Hammered piton after piton, the metal clanging dully against stone. Another man followed, carrying more rope. Euron stood with eyes narrowed, scanning the sky for any sign of wings. This spire was so exposed that if the ice dragon appeared, they would have nowhere to hide. Yet that was part of the point, for he desired confrontation as much as discovery. Slowly, the climbing pair made progress. When they reached a small ledge, they anchored rope, allowing the others to ascend. Euron insisted on going next, hooking his gloves around the rope and climbing with a fierce determination. Each breath felt like shards of glass in his lungs. The wind scoured him, threatening to pry him from the rock face. But he kept going, heaving himself upward. The shape concealed under his cloak pressed uncomfortably against his ribs, but he clung to it as though it were the key to everything he desired. The climb took hours, each step a test of resolve. The spire's surface offered few natural handholds, forcing them to rely on the rope and pitons. Now and then, a fragment of ice dislodged from high above and came crashing down, sending men clinging to the rock in terror. Yet, one by one they edged higher, drawn by Euron's pitiless will. Eventually, they reached a plateau not far below the summit. It was a relatively flat outcropping, shielded from the wind by a jagged overhang. The men collapsed there, panting, while Euron straightened and looked about. Even from this vantage, the view of the endless sea, dotted with icebergs, was breathtaking in a cruel, desolate way. He noticed that the plateau continued inward, forming a small shelf that led to a cavern in the spire's core, an opening they had not seen from below. He led them toward it, boots crunching over ice-laden gravel. The cavern yawned black, with stalactites of ice dangling ominously from the roof. The men lit torches, though in the bright glare reflecting off the snow, the flames seemed pale. Euron entered first, scanning the interior. The cave sloped gently downward, the walls slick with frozen condensation. The ceiling soared, vanishing into shadows. A low moaning sound echoed from within, possibly the wind funneling through cracks in the stone. With a gesture, Euron commanded the men to spread out. As they ventured deeper, the cavern widened, revealing a field of stalagmites rising from the floor like a frozen forest. The moaning grew louder, accompanied by a distant drip of melting water. The men's torches cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of wraiths dancing around them. Euron paused, removing his glove to rest a hand on a nearby pillar of ice. He felt the faint vibration of air, as if the spire itself breathed. A savage joy kindled in him. This place was as harsh and unyielding as his own spirit. Somewhere, in these labyrinthine depths or high above them, he might find a vantage to watch for the dragon's approach. They continued forward until they emerged into a natural chamber ringed by a frozen ledge. The floor dropped away at the center, forming a bowl filled with crystalline water. A weak shaft of light, filtering from a crack above, illuminated the water's surface with an unearthly glow. Euron inched to the edge, peering down. The pool was impossibly clear, reflecting his face in its depths. And though he did not say so aloud, he felt a fleeting sensation of dread, as if something stared back at him from far below. His lips twisted in a grin. He knelt, placing a hand on the ice at the rim of the pool, scanning the chamber for signs of life. The men fidgeted, uneasy in the silence. One ventured to the far side, aiming his torch at a rock shelf. Suddenly, the man shouted. He had spotted bones half buried in a drift of snow. The men hurried over, hearts pounding. The bones were large, arranged in a tangle. Some belonged to creatures with thick ribs and elongated skulls, possibly seals or whales that had been dragged up to this height by some force. Others appeared suspiciously human. Euron examined a broken femur. The marrow within turned to a blackish residue. His good eye flicked from the bones to the depths of the cavern. Something used this place as a lair, or perhaps had done so once. Could it have been the ice dragon? Or some lesser beast that prowled the northern storms? A sudden commotion made them whirl. Another man had strayed near the pool's edge and cried out, teetering precariously as the ice beneath his feet cracked. Euron bellowed for caution. Two men rushed to haul him back, just as the ice collapsed, sending shards plunging into the water below. The resulting splash echoed thunderously through the chamber. For a moment, all went still except for the dying echoes. Then from somewhere above or beyond the chamber, a low rumble reverberated. The men froze. It was impossible to say if it was an avalanche of ice or the growl of something colossal stirring from slumber. Euron gestured sharply, commanding silence. They listened, hearts pounding. Another rumble, more distant this time, as though it passed through multiple layers of stone. The men looked at each other with alarm. If the spire concealed an underground passage large enough for a beast of that size, they might be on the threshold of a dragon's nest. But would the beast truly choose such cramped confines? Euron weighed the possibilities, lips curving in a half-smile. Even if it were not the dragon's lair, it could be a location of arcane significance. A place where he might harness the relic he had seized from the ruined tower. He barked orders for the men to gather stones, break off shards of ice, and form a barrier around the pool's edge so that no one else risked falling in. They worked swiftly, their breath fogging the air. Meanwhile, he walked the circumference of the chamber, occasionally pausing to press his palm to the walls or to peer into the darker recesses where the torchlight did not fully reach. His posture suggested he was listening, sensing. For what? The men dared not guess. Satisfied at length, Euron announced they would camp here for the night. The men gaped at him. Camp? In a freezing cavern halfway up a spire in the middle of nowhere? Yes, they would. He wanted to see if the dragon would appear at twilight or dawn, and from this vantage point, if it flew anywhere near, they might glimpse it. Or so he insisted. The men grimaced, but they set about gathering what meager fuel they could. Some carried it in sacks strapped to their backs, while others chipped away at the ice to find bits of driftwood lodged in cracks. A small fire was lit near the chamber's edge, the flames casting ghastly shadows on the walls. They passed a miserable night. The rocky floor offered little comfort, and the wind howled through the fissures, occasionally sending blasts of frigid air that threatened to snuff the fire. Euron stood watch for most of it, pacing around the chamber's perimeter, cloak trailing like a tattered shadow. More than once, men glimpsed him clutching something beneath that cloak, a glimpse of pale crystal shaped like a claw. They noticed how the air around him seemed to shimmer faintly. He seemed possessed by a restless energy, as though the weight of his quest had grown ever more urgent. In the small hours of the night, two men claimed they heard distant roars emanating from far above. Scrambling to their feet, they peered at the cracks in the cave ceiling, half expecting to see massive talons ripping through the stone. But nothing followed except the rising wail of the wind. When Euron came to investigate, his face set in lines of impatience, they could only shrug helplessly. He cursed them for fools or worse, then resumed his pacing. Eventually, even he felt the drag of exhaustion and sank onto a ledge, letting his head rest against the stone, half dozing with one hand on his hidden relic. At dawn, if one could call that pale gloom dawn, they rose stiffly, joints aching. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers that barely glowed. Euron roused them with a glare, ordering them to take stock of supplies. One man discovered his waterskin had frozen solid. Another man's foot had turned black at the toes, a sure sign of frostbite. Euron paid these troubles no heed. He insisted they venture deeper into the spire, following the rumbles they had heard. The men paled but obeyed. They pressed on, skirting the edge of the pool and finding a narrow passage that spiraled upward around the cavern's perimeter. The going was treacherous. Ice coated the ledge, and one misstep would send a man plunging into the frigid water below. Yet they advanced slowly, hugging the wall. Torchlight revealed columns of swirling frost on the ceiling. Now and then, a chunk of ice dislodged, crashing down an explosion of shards. The passage led them around a bend and into a vertical chimney, an opening that rose through the stone like a winding throat. The walls were slick, but there were outcroppings where they could brace themselves. Euron gestured for them to climb, ignoring the men's muttered protests. Groping for handholds, they ascended, using ropes to hoist themselves. The darkness pressed close, until one of them found a gap overhead where pale light poured in like milk spilled on shadow. With strenuous effort, they emerged through the gap, blinking in a small plateau near the summit of the spire. The wind there was ferocious, howling around them, but the sky had cleared enough to provide a stark panorama of the icy seas below. They could see the silence anchored far off, a dark speck amid drifting ice. Another plateau to the south led to a sheer drop, but Euron ventured near it, unafraid of the howling abyss. The men were about to draw breath in relief that nothing monstrous lurked at the summit. Then, without warning, a roar fractured the air. It came from above, a resonant cry that slammed into them like a physical force. They staggered, hearts in their throats, and scanned the sky. The sun's weak light cut through the clouds, revealing a shape emerging from the swirling mists. Once more, that pale silhouette of colossal wings and a serpentine neck. The ice dragon. Its roar buffeted them, an exhalation of bone-chilling cold. The men scrambled for cover behind the rocks. Euron stood in the open, face contorted in exultant rage. Here was the beast he had pursued to the ends of the earth. The dragon swept over the spire, gliding with an eerie grace that belied its size. Its translucent scales caught the sparse sunlight, shimmering like living frost. Euron watched, cloak whipping, as it arced overhead. The men cowered, certain that a blast of freezing breath would rain upon them at any moment, turning them into statues of ice. Yet the dragon merely roared again, circling once before drifting off into the swirling white horizon. Euron let out a savage bellow, brandishing the crystal claw from beneath his cloak. The men saw it glint in the feeble daylight, and the relic seemed to hum, though the wind devoured all subtler sounds. Euron's shout echoed after the retreating dragon. A challenge, a command, or a lament. The beast, either unimpressed or uninterested, slid away into the clouds, leaving them with only the memory of its colossal presence. Euron pivoted to the men, madness gleaming in his eye, and roared at them to follow. Down the opposite side of the spire lay a narrow ridge. It led, presumably, to another slope or pass where they might track the beast. The men looked at one another in horror. Scaling down that ridge was suicide. Sheer drops on both sides, battered by violent winds. But Euron's word was law. He had glimpsed his prize again, and he would not let it slip away. They tested the ridge, finding it only wide enough for a single foot in some places. The wind threatened to knock them off balance with each gust. Euron went first, pressing himself against the rock face, inching along. The men followed in a chain, each clutching the rope, trembling. Below them yawned a dizzying drop into swirling mists. One false move would send a man plummeting out of sight. The only comfort was that the spire's rock offered a few cracks to grip. At last, they reached a broader outcropping, from which they could descend more safely. The men fell to their knees in relief. Euron wasted no time, scanning the horizon for the dragon. In the distance, the swirling banks of cloud parted just enough to reveal a silhouette, cutting low over the ice-littered sea. Euron hissed in triumph. He pointed, urging them onward. The land sloped into a rocky valley, a small pass that might lead them back to the shoreline. They slid down it, half-controlled, losing their footing on the slick ground. More than once, men crashed into each other, bruising limbs. Euron stayed ahead, unstoppable, the crystal claw clutched like a beacon. Every so often, he raised it as if trying to make contact with the dragon. But the beast had flown too far to be lured by such gestures. The valley took them onto a plain of ice, a shelf that extended out to the sea's edge. Broken ridges of ice rose like walls. They navigated carefully, listening for the thunder of shifting glaciers. All the while, Euron pushed them at a pace none could sustain for long. They had brought minimal provisions for this expedition. Already, thirst gnawed at their throats, and the fierce cold leached strength from their bones. Yet they dared not ask for rest. Euron had glimpsed his quarry and was in no mood for hesitation. Several hours later, the men stumbled upon a frozen inlet. Great arches of ice reached overhead, forming a partial dome. Through gaps in the ice, they could see the rolling sea beyond. Euron slowed, scanning every shadow. The place felt half-subterranean, as though the ocean had carved a cathedral within the glacial shelf. Stalactites hung, dripping slowly. The hush here was eerie, broken only by their ragged breathing. Then a deep rumble resonated. Euron froze, hand tightening on the claw. The men gripped their weapons, hearts pounding. Another rumble, and the ice overhead trembled. Shards broke free, clattering onto the floor. A shape stirred at the far end of the inlet, dimly visible through the gloom. Pale dot. Colossal. The faint shimmer of frost-laced scales. A monstrous reptilian head rose, turning glowing eyes toward the intruders. The men nearly dropped their weapons in terror. The ice dragon, perhaps the same one they had seen above, or another of its kind, lay coiled like a serpent among the shards, its breath sending a haze of mist into the air. Euron's face contorted in wild exultation. He took a step forward, ignoring the men's frantic whispers to fall back. Slowly, the dragon uncoiled, scraping talons across the ice, causing hairline cracks to dart outward from beneath its weight. Those blazing eyes fixed on Euron. The cold that radiated from its body was palpable, a living aura of winter. Euron raised the crystal relic, pointing it at the dragon in a gesture of command or supplication. The beast hissed, exhaling a frigid wind that rattled armor and made frost bloom on beards. Still, Euron stood, chanting something under his breath. The men, half collapsed behind blocks of ice, watched as the swirling whiteness thickened around the relic. It pulsed faintly, as if in answer to the dragon's presence. Euron's lips twisted in pain or rapture as the temperature plummeted further. His breath no longer merely fogged. It crystallized in the air. An otherworldly hush descended, broken only by the men's panicked attempts to keep from freezing. The dragon, for its part, seemed perplexed by the phenomenon. It reared back slightly, wings scraping the icy ceiling. A single drop of water plinked from a melting icicle. An absurdly small sound in the midst of such a confrontation. Euron's chant grew louder, syllables echoing strangely off the ice, as though multiple voices joined him. The relic's glow intensified, albeit faintly, weaving tendrils of pale light around his hand. He advanced another step. The dragon snarled, baring teeth like frozen daggers. A wave of cold blasted forth, sending spiderweb cracks skittering across the floor. Euron was thrown back a pace, boots sliding on the slick surface. But he did not fall. Instead, he roared in defiance and thrust the relic forward. The crystal talon flared, capturing the shifting light in prismatic shards. The dragon hissed again, uncertain. Then the creature unleashed a roar that seemed to shake the foundations of the ice. A swirling gale whipped through the cavern, tearing at cloaks and nearly extinguishing torches. One of the men, unable to withstand the furious wind, was blown off his feet, sliding across the ice until he slammed into a wall, unmoving. Euron stood firm, Caught in the eye of the storm, the relics glow, battling the dragon's raw power. For a heartbeat, they seemed locked in some primal stalemate. Man versus beast, mortal ambition versus ancient fury. But the relic was no perfect artifact. Cracks lined its crystalline edges, and Euron's control was imperfect at best. The swirling energies faltered. The dragon seized the moment, lunging forward with a bellow, jaws wide. Euron dove aside, narrowly escaping a snap that would have torn him in half. Talons raked the ice, sending shards flying. The men scattered, yelling in terror. The beast's tail lashed, crashing into a pillar of ice, which fractured and collapsed with a deafening roar, narrowly missing a cluster of men who dove away at the last instant. Euron rolled, gripping the relic so tightly that his knuckles went white. He spat curses, regaining his feet, chanting anew, "Die go!" Their pitiful crossbow bolts clattered off the dragon's scales, achieving little more than drawing its ire. The men realized, with hearts sinking, that they had no chance of victory. This was not a wounded beast pinned by nets and runes. It was a savage god of winter, awakened and enraged by their intrusion. The temperature dropped another degree, biting cruelly. Frost crackled in their clothing, stiffening every joint. Euron refused to yield, though blood trickled from a gash on his brow, where he had struck the ice. His single eye blazed with an unholy fervor as he advanced again, chanting, brandishing the relic. This time the dragon lunged, jaws parted in a gout of freezing breath that coalesced into spears of ice. Euron swiped the relic in a desperate arc, deflecting some of the shards. Others struck the ground around him, exploding into fragments that cut men's faces and arms. The men pleaded with Euron to retreat, but he ignored them, the chant rising to a near scream. Veins stood out in his neck as he poured every ounce of twisted will into subjugating the beast. And for one moment, one terrible instant, it seemed he might succeed. The dragon faltered, jaws trembling, as if wrestling with invisible chains. The light from the relic flared, and Euron's voice echoed unnaturally. But the relic was flawed, and the dragon's fury immense. With a final wrenching roar, the beast shattered the intangible bond. A shockwave of cold ripped through the inlet, toppling men like dolls. Euron was hurled against a pillar, the relic knocked from his grasp. He slid to the ground, coughing blood, while the dragon whipped its head around, glaring at him with crystalline malice. The men, seeing their captain fallen and the relic spinning away, lost all nerve. They scrambled in a blind panic, half running, half crawling for the inlet's exit. The dragon's tail slammed down, fracturing the ice and sending shockwaves that nearly swallowed them in chasms. Snow and shards flew in every direction. Euron lay dazed, ears ringing. His ribs ached with each ragged breath. He reached for the relic, only a few feet away. His fingers brushed its surface. It flickered once, faintly, but the cracks in its structure spread, the glow dying. The dragon thundered forward, each talon strike shaking the ground. Summoning the last of his strength, Euron lurched to his feet and darted aside, narrowly evading the beast's snapping jaw. The men at the entrance yelled for him, though few truly cared for his survival. They simply could not imagine facing the sea without a captain. Euron snatched up the relic, pressing it to his chest. The cold seared him like fire. He staggered across the slick floor, while the dragon raked a claw, nearly bisecting him. A chunk of ice crashed down, tearing a deep gash in his leg. He stumbled, gritting his teeth in agony, but forced himself forward, spurred by the raw instinct to survive. At last he cleared the inlet, emerging into the frigid air outside, limping. The men had already started to run, scattering in multiple directions. Euron screamed at them to regroup, but the howling wind devoured his voice. Behind him, the dragon lunged halfway out of the cavern, wings flared, unleashing a shriek that rattled the heavens. Euron turned, fury and despair contorting his features. Blood dripped from his brow, mixing with the snow. The relic in his arms was inert, its once luminous crystals dulled by spiderweb fractures. He spat a curse at the dragon, at the gods, at fate itself. Then he limped away, adrenaline alone carrying him. The beast did not follow far. Perhaps it considered them no longer worth the effort, or the labyrinth of ice choked its path. Regardless, within moments, Euron found himself stumbling across the frozen plain with what remained of his men, bruised, half-frozen, and weaponless. A few crossbows littered the ground where men had dropped them. No one stopped to retrieve anything but what they could carry. They fled toward the slope that would lead them back up the rocky valley. No plan except to survive another hour. The swirling wind battered them. Euron's leg burned, blood staining the white ice in macabre footprints. He paused once, leaning on a half-buried chunk of ice, to glare back at the inlet. The dragon's roars subsided, replaced by the incessant wail of the wind. The relic pressed to his chest felt cold as death, no sign of life within. But Euron's fury had not abated. If anything, it grew more potent, a black hatred twisting his mind. He had come so close to binding the beast. He would not rest until he found a way to claim it. No matter the cost, no matter the blood spilled. They struggled on for hours, half lost in the storm, until at last they caught sight of the spire's silhouette in the distance. The climb back would be torture, but at least they knew where they were. Men fell to their knees, praying for any measure of mercy from the elements. Euron raged, demanding they rise. He kept them moving until they reached the precarious slope from which they had descended, then bullied them into ascending once more. Their limbs felt like lead. Some men collapsed, never to stand again. Euron did not pause for them. If they were not strong enough, they were of no use. By the time they rejoined the path leading to the spire's summit, the day had dimmed to that perpetual twilight. The men were numb, eyes glazed. Euron's leg wound pulsed with agony, and he knew infection might well set in. But a worse fate awaited them if they lingered here. Together, they retraced their path, negotiating the treacherous ridge. Euron went first, fury lending him a semblance of balance. The relic remained clutched in his arms, though the men had seen it fail. Perhaps it was worthless now. Yet he would not relinquish it. Night closed in, and they huddled in the same plateau cave where they had sheltered before, too exhausted to descend to the silence. No fire could be coaxed from the sodden wood. They lay in near darkness, the only light the faint glow of the moon through the cave mouth. Euron braced himself against a wall, breath ragged, leg throbbing. He turned the relic in his hands, studying the cracks. A swirl of half-mad thoughts raced through his mind. New rituals, new bargains, new murders that might feed enough power into the relic to resurrect its potency. He bared his teeth in a silent promise to the dragon that this was not the end. Morning found half the men too weak to stand. Euron forced them onward anyway, prodding them with curses. They made the final climb down the spire's face in a haze of pain and desperation, slipping on ice-laden ropes. One man plummeted to his death, screaming all the way. They heard the sickening thud of his body against the rocks below. The survivors pressed on, numb to horror. At last, they reached the shelf where the longboat waited, battered by the tides. The row back to the silence was a blur of half-frozen limbs pulling on oars. Euron slumped in the prow, cradling the ruined relic. A savage wind scoured them, as though mocking their escape. When at last they clambered up the silence's ladder, they found the crew on deck as battered as they were. Several men had died in the time they were gone, consumed by cold or despair. Euron limped across the deck, ignoring the stares, ignoring the hush that fell as men took in his injuries, the blood-soaked bandage around his leg, the haunted mania in his eye. He barked at them to raise anchor, to steer away from the spire. The men hesitated, wanting to know what had happened. If the dragon had been vanquished or captured. Euron's glare was lethal. He hissed that the beast still lived, and that he would have his vengeance in due time. The immediate goal was survival, to return to open waters where they might find a vantage or a new strategy. The battered silence creaked as it turned about, sails snapping in the wind. The men worked the rigging with trembling arms, each footstep sending shards of ice skittering across the deck. Euron retreated to his cabin, dragging his injured leg. A hill of blood dripped behind him. Once the door slammed, the men exhaled in collective relief, though none felt safe. The memory of that monstrous roar lingered, and if Euron survived his wounds, they all knew he would lead them on yet another insane hunt. In the face of such unstoppable obsession, hope was a fragile thing. easily crushed by the next lashing gale. Days passed in a blur of agony. Euron barely emerged from his cabin, except to shriek demands for the men to sail north, then east, then north again. He seemed uncertain, or perhaps half delirious from fever, but the crew dared not defy him openly. They navigated the drifting ice fields, pausing only to carve fresh water from floes. The men lost track of time. The sun remained hidden behind thick clouds, and the nights were little different from the days. Euron's leg festered, but he refused any attempt by the ship's meager surgeon to amputate. He would not surrender to mortal frailty. The door to his cabin stayed locked most of the time, and the men heard unearthly cries from within. Some swore they heard a second voice, low and resonant, as though Euron conjured the presence of the dragon in his delirium. At last, one bleak morning, Euron lurched onto the quarterdeck, leaning on a cane carved from a piece of driftwood. His face was drawn, the patch over his eye crusted with salt, yet a frantic energy sparked in his gaze. He surveyed the men, silent for a time. Then he declared that he had divined a path forward. The dragon roamed these seas, but it was cunning, and to corner it, they needed more than brute force. They needed a lure, and the only lure a dragon might obey was warmth, or so Euron proposed. If they could kindle a grand blaze on the ice, a feat seemingly impossible, perhaps they could coax the beast near, drawn by curiosity or hunger. The men gaped at him. Where would they find enough fuel in this frozen wasteland to build a blaze that could be seen from the skies? Euron smirked. He pointed to the barrels of pitch and oil they still carried in the hold. Rations had run low, but they still had some supplies meant for siege warfare, flammable substances for burning enemy vessels. Euron commanded them to search for a suitable ice floe, one large enough to anchor a pyre, and then wait for the dragon to appear. In the hush that followed, no man had the courage to tell Euron that this plan seemed as mad as any that had come before. Fear of him, and fear of the dreaded hush that might follow disobedience, sealed their tongues. So they sailed on, scanning the horizon for a thick slab of ice that might serve as a floating platform. It took 2 more days before they spotted one, a truly massive floe, wide enough to hold the silence if they had dared to land upon it. It drifted with stately grace, bobbing amid lesser shards. Euron ordered them to approach. The men used rowboats to ferry casks of pitch and oil onto the floe, forming a ragged pile in the flow's center. The wind cut across them, and they moved gingerly to avoid fracturing the ice. Euron himself oversaw the operation, leaning on his cane, his injured legs stiff. His breath came out in ragged bursts. Once the barrels were in place, the men constructed a crude pyre around them, splintered timbers from the hold, old crates, broken pieces of the deck that they could spare. It was a meager supply of wood, but the casks themselves would generate the largest flames, if they could be lit. The men hammered in metal spikes to secure the barrels so they would not roll off. Euron demanded more. He wanted a roaring inferno, a beacon that would burn away the gloom and draw the dragon as a moth is drawn to a candle. When at last the men claimed they had nothing else to feed the blaze, Euron raised a hand, halting them. He gestured for them to return to the silence. He would oversee the final stage. Even the bravest of the crew hesitated to leave their captain alone on such a precarious floe. But Euron's will was iron. They rowed back to the silence, anchored at a cautious distance. From the rail, they watched Euron limp around the barrels, scattering some powder from a pouch, perhaps to feed the flames further. He raised a torch high. Even in the distance, they could see the red glow flickering across the ice. Then, with a dramatic flourish, Euron lowered the torch and touched it to the pitch-soaked cloth. Fire erupted. A tall column of flame spewed from the barrels, black smoke billowing skyward. The inferno spread rapidly, fueled by the pitch. Euron stood near its perimeter, a silhouette against a backdrop of blazing orange. The heat shimmered. Sparks spat upward, drifting into the low-hanging sky. Men shielded their faces, though they were some distance away. The ice around the pyre hissed and cracked, water beginning to pool in shallow depressions. Still, the blaze roared, sending plumes of greasy smoke high. Euron raised his arms to the sky, cane clattering to the ground beside him. He seemed to be shouting something lost in the roar of the flames. From the deck of the Silence, the men watched in horrified awe. A few believed the entire floe would soon melt or split, plunging Euron and the fire into the sea. But Euron did not waver. He stood at the edge of the inferno, letting sparks and cinders dance around him. Smoke coiled upward in a black column that stained the sky. The men exchanged fearful glances, half expecting a monstrous shape to appear from the clouds above. But for long moments, there was only the crackle of flames and the hiss of boiling ice. Then faintly, a roar echoed. The men tensed. Another roar followed, closer this time. Euron whirled, scanning the skies, face illuminated by hellish light. The flames writhed, sending a wave of heat that made the ice groan underfoot. Above, the gloom parted to reveal a swirl of white, and through it, the shape of enormous wings beating the air. The ice dragon. It circled overhead, drawn by the conflagration that defied the frozen realm. The men on the Silence cowered, certain that the beast would turn its wrath upon them. But the dragon's attention was on the floating beacon. It roared once more, the sound reverberating across the water. Euron raised his voice in reply, gesturing wildly at the monster. The fire's reflection danced in his single eye, a gleam of unhinged ambition. The dragon dove lower, curiosity piqued, or perhaps enraged, by the audacity of this display. The men watched, hearts hammering as it circled the floe, wings churning the air. The blaze gusted with each beat, sending sparks swirling. Euron stood at the very edge, cloak whipped about by the searing wind. If the beast unleashed its icy breath, the flames might vanish in a heartbeat, replaced by a frost-laden storm. Or perhaps the heat of the fire might confuse it, cause it to hesitate. The men clenched the railings, unable to tear their eyes away. In a single titanic swoop, the ice dragon descended, landing heavily on the floe's far side. The impact sent cracks racing across the ice, water welling up. The men on the Silence cried out. Euron did not move except to pivot and face the dragon, arms outspread. Fire raged between them, a barrier of heat and light. The dragon snarled, lowering its head. Frosty breath curled around its jaws, meeting the scorching air from the flames in a cloud of steam. For a suspended moment, the two powers, fire and ice, warred in that patch of frozen sea. Then Euron hurled something into the flames. A small cask, perhaps of oil, or some enchanted mixture. The blaze flared violently, sending out a shockwave of heat that made the dragon recoil. Steam billowed, obscuring everything. The men strained to see. Euron vanished behind a wall of smoke. They heard a roar, uncertain whether it was the dragons or their captains. The entire floe bucked, fracturing in multiple places. Shadows moved within the steam. Suddenly, the dragon's head lunged through the haze. Its jaws clamped onto something. Firelight glinted on teeth like crystal spears. The men on the Silence cried out, believing Euron had been devoured. But through the swirling steam, a figure darted aside. A flash of black cloak, a glint of steel. Euron Greyjoy yet lived, sprinting across cracking ice. Flames licked at his heels. Another section of the floe collapsed, hissing as it met the frigid water. The dragon hissed, thrashing its neck from side to side, uncertain how to navigate this flaming chaos. The ice buckled beneath its enormous weight. With a desperate leap, Euron landed behind a chunk of ice near the dragon's flank, half hidden by the roiling steam. He raised his sword, hacked at something. The beast roared in pain or frustration, flailing its tail. Another chunk of the floe sheared off and vanished beneath the waves. Fire leapt in bright arcs, fed by casks that ruptured one by one. The men on the Silence stared, transfixed. The horror of it defied words. The final cask exploded in a plume of scorching fire. The dragon recoiled, wings snapping outward. As if to take flight, a swirling column of sparks enveloped it. Euron staggered forward, clothes singed, sword dripping with oily water. He threw himself at the dragon's hind leg, slamming his blade against the translucent scales. The dragon bellowed, releasing a torrent of freezing breath that collided with the flames, sending a massive burst of steam into the air. Those watching from the Silence could see nothing but a blinding cloud that obscured the entire floe. When the steam finally dissipated, They glimpsed the floe in tatters, chunks of broken ice afloat, fires dying as the cold sea quenched them. The dragon had spread its wings, half airborne, hissing as it tried to gain height. Euron clung to one of its spines, battered and drenched, howling triumph or insanity into the gale. For a heartbeat, it seemed he would be carried off into the sky, a madman on the back of a beast that could never truly be tamed. Then the dragon bucked violently, shaking him loose. Euron crashed onto a fragment of ice that was already tipping into the water. Men screamed, watching as he sank beneath the surface. A swirl of foam closed over him. The dragon soared away, ragged in flight, losing a few broken scales that shimmered as they fell. The water frothed, and the men on the Silence rushed to lower boats. Hope warred with dread in their faces. If Euron drowned, they would be free of his madness, yet condemned to this frozen realm without a captain. Some part of them refused to believe he could truly die that easily. They rowed out, combing the debris-strewn waves. Smoking fragments of ice drifted around them, the last flickers of flame clinging to oiled wood. The sea hissed and sloshed. After endless minutes, one of the men shouted. A hand broke the surface, clutching at drifting timbers. The rowers heaved the boat around, leaning over to grab a half-conscious Euron Greyjoy. They dragged him aboard, sputtering and half-frozen, blood seeping from multiple gashes. A black burn marred one side of his face where the flames had singed him. His lips moved, uttering garbled sounds. Yet that single eye opened, fixating on them with an intensity that defied death. The men stared, a jolt of primal fear coursing through them. Even at the brink of the grave, Euron's spirit refused to yield. They hauled him back to the Silence, where he coughed up seawater, rolled onto his back, and promptly slipped into unconsciousness. The men laid him in his cabin, stoking a fire in the small brazier there to warm him. They stripped away his wet clothing, revealing a patchwork of bruises and lacerations. Some wondered aloud if they should let him die, but no one dared take that step. Fear, or some lingering awe, stayed their hands. They bound his wounds as best they could. Outside, the sea remained eerily calm, with only the faint crack of shifting ice and the fading stench of pitch. Night fell, the Silence drifting among broken floes. The men, worn to the bone, fell into fitful slumber. Now and then, the wind carried distant roars, or perhaps the echoes of memory. Deep in the captain's cabin, Euron Greyjoy hovered between life and oblivion, feverish dreams swirling behind his eyelids. His breath rasped, and occasionally, his lips twitched around words no man could understand. Half prayers, half curses. Even in delirium, his fixation on the ice dragon burned as fiercely as the pyre he had ignited on the ice. The question lingered. Would he awaken with renewed vigor, or would his battered body finally betray him? Morning came, gray and joyless. The men discovered that the floating remnants of the great floe had drifted away in the night, leaving only slushy water. A half-dozen casks bobbed in the distance, the last remains of Euron's grand conflagration. In the cabin, the captain stirred. Sweat drenched his brow. His bandaged leg twitched. One of the men, a reluctant caretaker, leaned over him, pressing a hand to Euron's forehead. The fever was intense, scorching to the touch, as though a fire smoldered beneath his skin. The caretaker called for water, for the meager herbs they possessed. All day Euron lay in that half-dead stupor, muttering about dragons and crystals, about a throne of ice and a sea of blood. The men whispered among themselves, uncertain whether they should steer south now that their captain was incapacitated, or wait to see if he recovered. They hovered on the brink of mutiny, but fear paralyzed them. At dusk, as the light withdrew from the sky, Euron's ravings grew louder. He sat bolt upright, eyes unfocused, and seized the caretaker's arm with surprising strength. He demanded to know where the beast had gone. The caretaker stammered that it had flown away into the clouds. Euron's face contorted in a spasm of rage and pain. He swore he would chase it to the ends of the earth, that not even the cold grip of the grave could stop him. He tried to rise but collapsed, breathing ragged. The men eased him back. Perhaps the madness had peaked, they thought. But in the hours that followed, Euron seemed to rally. Though his leg was infected, though burns and lacerations crisscrossed his skin, he refused to slip into resignation. By the next morning, he managed to stand with support, leaning heavily on a cane. The caretaker, wide-eyed, tried to make him rest. Euron bared his teeth in a hideous grin. Pain burned away any gentler impulses he might once have harbored. Staggering onto the deck, he surveyed the men. His presence was like a blast of foul wind, choking any spark of rebellion. In a voice rasping with agony, he announced they would sail deeper into the frozen seas. The men looked at him as if he were already dead and commanding them from beyond the grave. No one dared speak. Euron roared that the dragon had faced his fire once. It would face it again, and next time he would seize the beast's reins or die trying. Fear and awe mingled in the men's hearts. Even as they dreaded continuing, the sight of Euron upright and vengeful quenched any talk of heading south. And so, the silence prowled onward, forging a path through the ever-shifting ice, the souls aboard enslaved by the mania of their captain. Each passing day, Euron's wounds knitted only slightly, never fully healing. A rancid odor clung to his bandages, yet he seemed possessed of a demonic vitality, fueling him like a twisted engine. He refused to relent, scanning the horizon for any sign of wings. If the men occasionally glimpsed that pale shape far away, Euron would push them to give chase, though it always vanished before they drew close. Rations dwindled further, and hope sank like a stone in dark waters. Weeks later, they found themselves amid a desolate stretch of sea where the ice floes resembled an unending field of broken glass. Euron paced the deck, supporting himself on his cane, each step a jolt of anguish. But he would not surrender, for the memory of that swirling steam and the dragon's roar still tormented his dreams. He had tasted its proximity, felt its might, and believed he could bind it, if only he discovered the right ritual, the right relic, the right sacrifice. He was willing to feed men, entire armies, into the dragon's maw, if it meant subjugating the creature for his own ends. Thus did the legend of Euron Greyjoy and the lost ice dragon persist in the frozen north. In scattered whispers across distant ports, sailors would speak of the battered warship glimpsed among the icebergs. Its sails tattered, crew half dead, led by a one-eyed specter who refused to accept mortality. Some said Euron had bargained his soul to dark gods, that he was cursed to roam the seas until he claimed the beast that would end the age of men. Others claimed he was already a wight, his body animated by hatred alone, his heart black ice. But the truth was both simpler and more terrible. He was a man who had surrendered every shred of sanity to ambition, determined to possess the unpossessable, to conquer a living storm and unleash it upon the north. Somewhere, in the swirling fog, the dragon soared, ever watchful, haunting those bleak skies. Its roars sometimes drifted over the water at twilight, a requiem for ships and men lost to the cold. In those moments, Euron stood at the prow, lips parted in a silent vow. He would close his eyes and feel the dragon's presence, a jolt of savage longing coursing through him. The men shrank from him, certain that no good would ever come of such a pursuit. They found themselves trapped in a nightmare without end. Storm after storm assailed them, chipping away at the silence. The hull carried the scars of countless collisions with ice, the sails forever on the verge of tearing away. Death stalked them daily. Yet Euron endured, and so they endured with him, following a dreadful magnetism that pulled them deeper into uncharted latitudes. His leg might give out, his cane might crack, but his obsession never wavered. Night after night, he tortured himself with new incantations gleaned from half-rotted scrolls in unknown tongues, burning the last scraps of the relic he possessed. Perhaps in another lost ruin, on another forsaken isle, he might discover a second artifact, or a demon-bound net to snare the dragon. Day by day his mania sank deeper roots. Thus, the endless chase stretched onward, woven into the howling winds and the grinding ice. Euron Greyjoy, battered in flesh but unbroken in will, kept his single eye locked upon the horizon, where a pale shape sometimes flickered in the snow-laden sky, and each time it vanished, he let out a silent snarl, determined that one day he would stand triumphant upon the back of that ice dragon. bearing down upon the north in a cataclysm of freezing wrath. The men trembled in their bunks, for they had peered into the heart of his darkness, and seen that no mortal force could quench it. If the dragon would not yield willingly, Euron would unleash nightmares until the entire realm lay drowned in ice and blood. In this way, the story finds no neat conclusion but rages on like the storms themselves. The North remained ignorant of how narrowly it had escaped disaster, and how close it still lingered to doom. For in the swirling snows, a twisted figure stood at the prow of a broken ship, haunted and driven, waiting for the roar that would signal another chance to claim an ancient terror, to bend winter's might to his vile command. Thus the cold wind carried his deranged laughter across the uncharted seas, a testament to the iron grip of ambition when it devours the last vestiges of a man's soul.